So, as we've mentioned more than once at this point, there's the books we love and the stories behind them. There's the joy of reading, the mysterious, wondrous, ineffable artistic achievement of writing, imagined worlds, creative feats, inspiration and whimsy. When I'm lucky enough to sit down and have these conversations with authors about how they do the things that they do, I'm often struck by the vast spectrum, from what we might call the work, on the one hand, that's the slog, the edits, the rewrites, the very deliberate honing of the book as this grounded, crafted thing. And then on the other hand, you have the creative impulse. When Booker Prize winner Paul Lynch was on Read This, he put it in particularly ethereal terms.
It goes back to the Greeks, actually, this idea of the word daemonic, the daemon. The Greeks called creativity the daemon. Socrates talked about it, when you were in communication with the gods, that you're this thing that you were channeling down was the daemon. And of course, we know it's internal, but it's the subconscious. And as a writer, you learn to live in proximity to that. You open the door to it, and I call it the door into the dark, and you learn to channel this energy, this voice from back there, or maybe it's down here somewhere. It's hard to know where it comes from, but it's deeply authentic, and it must be obeyed.
The mechanics of the book world, the heartbreaking quest for sales and recognition, the unglamorous jockeying for a publisher, for a place in the bookshops, for readers, all these things feel a long way from tales of inspiration. There's that brilliant line from Janet Malcolm's famous essay, The Journalist and the Murderer, where she damns the profession of journalists and writers in no uncertain terms. She says, "Every journalist who's not too stupid or too full of himself to notice what is going on knows that what he does is morally indefensible. He's a kind of confidence man, preying on people's vanity, ignorance or loneliness, gaining their trust and betraying them without remorse." Deliciously grim. And I thought of it when I was reading Dominic Amerena's debut novel, I Want Everything. One of the things I particularly enjoyed in that book is how deep into the venal, effortful part of the writer's life it's willing to delve. Amerena's been a writer for years. He's been involved in readers and writers groups, taught writing, edited writing, been generally immersed in the world of writing and writers. But this is his first novel. In it, his unnamed narrator comes across an elderly woman he recognises as Brenda Shales, an Australian literary luminary who has disappeared from the landscape. After contributing 2 seminal incendiary novels, Shales has willingly faded from public view and into obscurity. For our narrator, who is striving and mostly failing to build a career for himself as a literary icon, this serendipitous sighting might just be the opportunity and the idea he's been searching for. This could be his breakthrough. All it will take is lies, theft, and betrayal. And in Dominic Amerena's account of the world, these might be just the skills that make someone a writer. I'm Michael Williams, and this is Read This, a show about the books we love and the stories behind them. Ambition, is it always ugly?
I guess it can be. I think that it's something that every writer contains, whether they want to acknowledge it or not. And I guess my novel looks at the way that ambition and ethics kind of are balanced against each other. And I like exploring the idea of the kind of libidinal thrill of these ugly ambitions, which is expressed by my unnamed narrator's desire to be the next great Australian writer without writing a book of his own. And I think ambition can be something that is a bit of a sickness, but it's also something that kind of creates great work. And I think it's an endlessly kind of fascinating topic.
Yeah. The thing that struck me in your novel is, firstly, how thrilling and rare it is to have your narrator confess to his ambition. at the start. And the truth of it is, I think anyone who takes pride in their work, who wants to be good at what they do, who wants to achieve stuff, is just by dint of those conditions an ambitious person.
Yeah.
But lots of us feel the need to mask that or lie about that, or people are very uncomfortable saying, I want this.
And I think, I've now maybe moved into a phase of my career where I actually know a few people who earn a lot of money from their writing, and they don't have to do any other work, and they're quite independently wealthy. And one thing that they all share is a kind of really strong ambition and sense of kind of purpose, which I don't think makes them particularly happy. It kind of makes them neurotic and crazy, but they are obsessed with achieving and making great art. And I think that's a really interesting quality. And I wonder, is it possible to even make great art without this drive? And I agree. I think there's something particularly Australian about our rejection of ambition, and that you're supposed to think of the work that you make as something that just kind of happened, rather than something that you really worked hard for or kind of aimed high for as well. That pose of faux diffidence, that the line that was ubiquitous on social media for a while when people shared bits of writing they'd done and they'd be like, here's a little thing, I did a thing, or deliberately pretending to be offhand or to diminish it. Yeah. Because to say, I am proud of this, or I worked really hard on this, or I'm hoping this will make you cry or laugh or think, those things are somehow not worthy. Yeah. Well, why would you not, as an artist, want to kind of like create big feelings in other people? And I think that's a very ambitious thing to strive for, and we should be kind of proud of that rather than hide it. But I do think there's a particularly Australian desire to downplay any sort of artistic ambition. We go back to the cultural cringe is still quite strong, I think. And I think we should all be more ambitious, and we should all be more, we should be ambitious readers, we should be ambitious writers, and we should kind of hold art to a very high standard, I think. I think that's absolutely right. But the corollary of it in Australian culture is the idea of the laconic as well. That not only do we not show ambition, but we don't show great passion. We can't show emotion. We don't profess love in the public sphere, all those kind of things. And one of the things that you do so well in this book is make the case for how that's changed over the years, the generational divide. Brenda is a classic boomer. The narrator is a kind of elder millennial. And that divide goes no small way to defining the ways in which they regard ambition in their work, yeah? Yeah. Well, I think this is an interesting point, and I guess I set up this, duality between the two principal characters of my novel, one of whom is an unnamed narrator who's a kind of young man who has these ambitions to write the great Australian novel, very much quote unquote, alongside Brenda Shales, who is this kind of cult author from the 70s who wrote these two incendiary novels, disappeared from the public eye, and has had this great influence over Australian literary culture for the past 50 years. And in her, I guess I'm kind of interested in looking at this kind of trope of the literary recluse, the author who eschews kind of public attention, and also a writer who kind of writes difficult, knotty literary novels which also made her name, as opposed to maybe the narrator who you might think of as more of a neoliberal writer, where he's kind of thinking of the career comes before the writing, like the career kind of supersedes the writing. And I actually think it's kind of interesting that basically I think all writers have this kind of dual impulse, one of which is to kind of show themselves to the world through their writing or through the kind of, promotional aspects of being a public writer, but also to kind of hide and to kind of hide behind the work and not have to speak for it in a sense. Because I think one of the big differences now is that all writers are expected to take up the mantle of being a public figure almost before they've even written anything. We're kind of trained to be eloquent and verbal and very able to present our work in a digestible way, in a way that I'm not sure that you had to do that back 50 years ago, where the work perhaps could stand more for itself. But I also kind of want to contest this notion that, literary fiction was so different back then, and that something has been lost, because I think that is something that we all feel, but I don't know whether it's quite true. It's a nostalgia for something lost, which may have never existed. I'm not sure.
I think it's a really interesting question, because I think the modes of having to package yourself as a writer, the poses you strike, all of those things, those modes and those mechanisms might have changed, but I suspect they were always a function of it.
Definitely.
The writer as public figure, as public intellectual, as sudden expert on the subjects that they wrote about, who's expected to kind of sing for their supper. And one of the things that I think is quite interesting, and maybe has shifted, is that it seems to me can often be the locus of the ambition rather than the writing itself, is that their ambition, and maybe in the case of your unnamed narrator, this is a bit true, the ambition is for being a writer rather than having written or doing the writing.
Exactly. And I think when we think about this, maybe what has changed, I think, it's very deliberate in my novel that Brenda Shales, her story is very bound up in the Whitlam years, which is a kind of period of history I've always been very fascinated by, principally because I think this is a time when there are all these tectonic changes happening to Australian society. It seems the future's kind of up for grabs. Maybe it's going to be a bit more of a socialist future. That's what it looked like for a little while. But it's also, from people of my generation, it is this object of nostalgia where we kind of think back to a time that was before we were born, where we're like, well, that's when things could happen and the political future looked bright. And I think there's a kind of parallel there with the writing world, because that's how a lot of writers think back to a time before, that there was this time when difficult literature was kind of held up and you could have a career writing kind of literary fiction which was somehow more pure than it is today. And I do think there is a really kind of interesting economic element to it. And I often think back to artistic movements of the 90s, like grunge lit, basically existed because all the artists in Australia were on the dole. And Helen Garner as well, I think she thanked Centrelink more or less in the acknowledgements of one of her books, because she's like, without government support, she wouldn't have been able to write any of her books. And it's something that isn't really possible anymore. And that is something that I do think has been lost, that in an economic sense, I think it's much harder to put writing at the center of your life than it used to be. And I think in part my book is kind of obliquely referencing maybe the economic conditions which have made it more difficult to prioritize art and take it seriously.
I think, obliquely, but also directly. It is a book that, apart from what it has to say about intellectual and emotional precarity, financial precarity is a part of it. There is that kind of question about what it is to not be able to make choices just based on creativity or imagination alone. But by tethering Brenda's story so much to the kind of Whitlam years as well, that was an inflection point in cultural policy that also had a big impact on a kind of independent Australian identity on the page. The rise of small independent local presses meant that actually a different kind of Australian story started being told. I think up until the Whitlam era, the preponderance of sepia-toned, dun-coloured...
bushy stuff.
Historical. There are lots of explorers, lots of people going missing. And the idea of the Australian voice was a largely historical, realist, non-urban one. And that started to change around the time of Brenda Shales.
Well, yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think, when I was coming up with the character of Brenda, there were a lot of writers from that time which were feeding into this idea of this kind of composite character of a lot of kind of feminist or female writers from that era who've had a great influence on my work. There's a bit of Elizabeth Harrower in her. There's some Janet Frame.
Elizabeth Jolie?
Well, yeah, of course. Probably the most fun thing of creating Brenda was imagining the works that she might have written. And when I was kind of imagining the two books that she wrote, they're called Anchoress and The Widowers. When I was kind of imagining what these texts might have looked like, I kept returning to The Well, which is one of my favourite Australian novels, which is this, if you haven't read it, it's this psychosexual, lesbian, gothic, country kind of, I don't know, very strange, very dark, very sexy and weird and very Australian in a very smart way. And, when I was kind of rereading this book, I kept imagining that this is the type of book that Brenda Shales might have written and might have built her career upon.
It is remarkable, like that generation of women in particular in Australian fiction, how many of them there are, how sharp they are, like how amazing they are on the page, and by and large, how, at least until relatively recently, how more or less forgotten lots of them were.
Oh, it's crazy. It's
you know,
crazy.
even someone like Thea Astley, whose output was enormous, who
Miles Franklin a bunch of times,
although always had to share it.
Yeah.
You know, there is an interesting. People will remember Patrick White. They won't necessarily talk about Astley. They won't necessarily talk about any number of them, and it's wild.
Yeah, and you think like, you know, even Helen Garner, she's somewhat getting her day in the sun overseas now, but you know, it seems crazy to me that, you know, this is the first time that Britain and America is paying attention to Helen Garner and Alexis Wright as well. It seems very instructive.
Coming up after the break, we discuss the difficulties of anonymity, and Dominic explains why living abroad has made him appreciate Australia's vibrant literary scene. We'll be right back. One of the pleasures of I Want Everything lies in the sections that are written from Brenda's perspective. As she unveils her life story to Amerena's narrator, her voice is distinctive. Her recounting of a life of horrors and disappointments is particularly well realised. And what's clear is the way in which her experience of being underestimated as a writer and dismissed as a political thinker is both typical of Australia in the period and also intensely gendered. The larger-than-life literary figure who's chosen to remain in the shadows is clearly a lot of fun to write.
There is lots of kind of supposition about who she is. Maybe it's a nom de plume. Maybe she's another writer who's written these novels. And, you know, I was really interested in this idea when it really came to me during the Ferrante scandal, where you had this, like, scumbag Italian journalist tracking down this translator and, you know, fingering her as the culprit who's written these fantastic novels. And I was like, well, what's going on here? Like, why do people care so much that a writer wants to be anonymous? And especially today, I think it's very interesting that we live in such a competitive attention economy that anybody who actively rejects attention, we reject that rejection. We think it's really dangerous, and we think it's something that has to be kind of weeded out and kind of revealed. And I guess in my narrator's desire to kind of worm his way into Brenda Shell's life and kind of learn her story, I was referencing maybe this idea about what is this unconscious hatred we have of people who refuse attention.
How much do you think it comes from feeling like someone who manipulates us through art owes us something? That, you know, that, okay, well, you're able to produce these emotions, you're able to kind of carry me along for a story. You owe it to me to expose yourself a bit so that I know who's taken me for this ride.
That is a really interesting idea. I don't think I've ever thought about it in quite those terms, but I guess it is it can be a really personal thing when, you know, you're reading a book that you kind of connect with. And I don't think it's strange that we want to know more about the writers who write these books. I just think it's strange that we force them into the public in a way that they don't necessarily want to be. In my narrator's kind of desire to, well, he wouldn't say expose, but expose the brutal truth of, you know, what Brenda Shell's novels meant and why she kind of disappeared from the public eye. His way of making art is very gendered. It's very extractive. It's very kind of, it has some parallels with colonialism as well. It's like, it's a way of telling a story which isn't his, which he can kind of steal for himself. And I guess throughout the novel, all of the ethics of using other people's stories is very much kind of like ever present.
I'm glad you mentioned the colonial overtones, because it is a very Australian story to identify a good story on which you can build your own idea. And that tension runs through it as well. Given all of this, given that you're presenting a couple of different models of writerly choices or ways to be in the world as a writer, where do you situate yourself in that?
Wow, yeah, that's a very tough question. You know, it's weird. You don't really know how you're going to go in the public until you're in the public. And I have found myself enjoying it much more than I thought. And it took me a while to accept that in myself. I felt a bit sick. I've written this book about an ambitious writer, and here I am getting some skerrick of success, and I'm really enjoying it. But now I've kind of come to think that I'm really proud of the novel, and I think it's okay to enjoy what little success comes one's way, because it takes a really long time to write a book.
It's a long time between drinks. You need to be able to strut when you're allowed to strut.
Exactly.
That's the thing. Like your unnamed narrator, you share your life with another writer, and I'm always interested in writers who are in a relationship, who live together, and the ways in which that works and the ways in which that causes friction. For your unnamed narrator, it's not great.
I would say, you are right, yes. I am in a relationship. I live in Greece with my wife, Eleanor Savage, who, the best Australian writer, and I would say. But the novels, the relationship between the narrator and his girlfriend, I don't think accurately reflects our relationship to each other's work. And I think it's actually kind of interesting. I had to change the book a bit because perhaps at one time it did resemble our relationship, which is much more supportive, collaborative. We're always each other's first reader. I've read a million drafts of her book. She's read a million drafts of my book. We really do kind of work together in a way that's quite beautiful and quite nice. And I can't really imagine making work without her as a support. During a certain draft, that sort of collaborative relationship was present in the text. And, I got a few notes from readers. It's like, it's a little bit boring to read this. We need to kind of put a bit more tension in. So I had to end up making it a bit more competitive.
I like that you had to change it not because of fear of betrayal, as would have happened to your character, but you had to change it just because real life is a little too mundane and nice. How for you was going from the shorter form and from essays to a novel? Because part of what makes a novel work is the richness of the world that you paint, which is built on such little stories, fabrications and digressions and whatever. From what I understand, this book came out of winnowing down a much bigger book rather than building up a shorter thing.
Yes, masochist that I am, I had this very long, unwieldy, had a spec fit conceit, which is not really my thing. I don't know why I kind of went down this path. It was very long, and then it was just doing my head in. And there were just a couple of scenes in there which I really enjoyed writing. They were like the kind of treat that I was returning to, which was this relationship between this character and an older novelist. And that was really kind of what I was enjoying writing. And it took me a while to give myself permission to imagine, well, what if it was just that story? And once I did, I was able to kind of get rid of the rest and drill down into that relationship, and suddenly everything just unlocked and it opened up, and it taught me something about, I don't know, this intuition about the writing and finding where the heat is in the writing. And I found I was really enjoying writing it, and I feel like that sense of kind of excitement kind of transmitted to the reader, or at least I hope it did.
So if that heat in part corresponds with pleasure, the heat in the writing is the bit where you're having fun doing it. What role does discomfort play in finding the heat?
That is interesting. It's like, I suspect maybe you have to go through the discomfort to find the pleasure, or perhaps the discomfort is in the editing. The pleasure is in the writing, and the discomfort is in turning it into something that functions as a kind of text. Because, sometimes it starts off a bit raw, sometimes it can be a bit digressive, and maybe the discomfort is in deciding what has to be there and what shouldn't be there, and what's there just to entertain you and what's there to entertain the reader, and what the difference between those two things, and making those sometimes very difficult decisions about what the form and what the final kind of text should look like. So maybe writing is pleasurable and editing is horrible.
Just before I let you go, you mentioned you and Eleanor live in Greece. And from what I understand, one of your motivations for moving overseas was to focus on your writing for both of you, to create a space where you could go and do that. And I'm interested in whether that's your version of being a Brenda Shales-style recluse, whether you had to remove yourself from the scene and the conversations and the comparisons and the awareness of the book industry, such as it is. How much did being outside that help you?
I think that's a really interesting question. And again, I think there's no kind of easy answer about whether it's helpful or unhelpful to be embedded in a literary scene. I think in some senses it can be really generative and it can be really fun to be in a community of writers where you're always talking about writing, you're always talking about ideas. But in another sense, it can subsume the work sometimes. And I don't think it's particularly healthy to just be talking about who got which grant and who got which book deal. And sometimes it is beneficial to kind of have some distance from that. But ironically, living in Greece, we found ourselves missing these conversations. And so, we found ourselves really trying to kind of embed ourselves or even create a literary scene in Greece. So, we started a reading series where we brought together international and Greek writers. And, we've been trying to kind of build these connections because I think we didn't know how much we would miss it. And so we had to kind of build it ourselves. And it's been very kind of lovely to come back to Australia. And I think we were talking about this off air, which is just the writing world has a reputation for being backbiting and competitive, and it can be, but I also think that writers are really comrades and they really act that way to each other. They really read each other's work with love and we all want the best for each other. And that is sometimes hard to remember when I'm living overseas. So it's been really nice to kind of reconnect with that.
Finally, is the ambitious writer ever satisfied?
No, because, it's like I would say a satisfied artist, it's like the death drive. It's, you have to be always striving. I think it kind of goes back to, some of the things we've touched upon, which is that if you stake your levels of happiness and satisfaction on the external validation, the reviews, the readership, the success, you will eventually be very disappointed because it can never be enough. But I think this whole process has taught me that if you can find pleasure in actually writing, then it doesn't really matter, the rest of it, which is what I say, while my book is out and everybody's reading it. So, it's easy for me to say this.
It's the perfect time to say it.
Yeah.
Dom, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Michael. It was great.
Dominic Amerena's debut novel, I Want Everything, is available at all good bookstores now. Before we go, I wanted to tell you what I've been reading this week, and it's another debut novel, this one by Melburnian Sinead Stubbins. It's called Stinkbug, and it's a corporate satire set behind the scenes in an advertising agency who are off on a retreat that may or may not have nefarious intentions. It might just have horrible corporate ones. But the book is really funny, it's really well put together. Sinead Stubbins, well worth a read. You can find it and all the other books we mentioned at your favourite independent bookstore. That's it for this week's show. If you enjoyed it, please tell your friends and rate and review us. It helps a lot. Next week on Read This, I'm joined by Irish author Kevin Barry to discuss his latest book, the gorgeous The Heart in Winter.
I was out walking again. I was in the hills nearby where I live in County Sligo in the northwest. Just walking through the woods on the side of a mountain one day, and just had a vision in my mind's eye of a young couple on horseback riding double. And I thought, if they're riding double, they must be trying to get away from someplace fast. They're in trouble, And it struck me about them as I saw them in my mind's eye that they were kind of very slight. They were kind of waifish. So these weren't heroic characters or cowboys or anything, But I thought, where are they trying to get away from? They're on a horse. It's a Western. What if it's Butte, Montana in 1891? Just very quickly, this succession of thoughts. And I thought, okay, that's the setup. Runaway lovers. Very easy. Make it fucking easy for yourself,
Read This is a Schwartz Media production made possible by the generous support of ARA Group. The show is produced and edited by Clara Ames, with mixing by Travis Evans and original compositions by Zoltan Fetcher. Thanks for listening. See you next week.